The first red flag was not the smug smirk on Julian's face. It was the fact that the email summoned me to the HR office at 7:58 in the morning with no subject line. And the word urgent typed in all caps like a panicked toddler trying to play grown-up. I had not even finished my second cup of black coffee when I walked in and saw the kid already perched in my usual chair, like he owned the air in the room. Julian, all 28 years of unearned entitlement, squeezed into a slim fit blazer with an overpriced haircut, did not even look up when I entered. He just tapped an expensive pen against his teeth, like he was waiting for a food delivery, not about to gut the operational heart of the company. "Walter," he said, drawing out my name like the syllables themselves offended his delicate ears. "Thanks for coming in early. We will keep this brief." The HR representative sat tight in the corner like a hostage, avoiding all eye contact. That was when I knew I did not need to hear the speech. Of course, Julian gave it anyway. After reviewing departmental efficiencies, he began, using a phrase he had definitely read off a professional networking site that morning. "We have concluded your role has become non-essential. We are streamlining legacy costs and bringing in fresh perspectives. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties." He actually smiled, as if he had just solved global poverty by axing the man who kept this entire logistics operation from collapsing into flaming chaos. I did not flinch, no begging, no angry monologue. I just adjusted my collar, slid my company-issued laptop across the polished table like I was handing him a dead goldfish, and stood up. "Streamline this," I muttered under my breath just for myself, and walked out with more dignity than he would ever earn in his lifetime. It is funny how that works. You work at a place for 15 years, bleed into the cracks of its foundation, clean up its messes, and save its skin during every major merger panic. Then, one kid with a business degree and his father's password can erase your existence before 9 o'clock in the morning. Back in my office, which was now my former office, I grabbed my box of personal belongings. Photos of my dogs, a framed quote from my late father that read, "Do not get mad, get even," and a small USB flash drive that had been taped securely under my bottom drawer with a small label that read Clause 12C. I did not cry and I did not swear. I just walked out through the same glass double doors I had opened every morning for a decade and a half. But this time I did not swipe my badge on the way out. I paused, smiled at the receptionist, and told her she did not need to worry about disabling my login credentials just yet. The kid thought he had cut the head off a useless relic. He had no idea he had just unplugged the main power source of the company. The box of my desk items was still warm from the car ride home, rattling softly as I set it down on my dining room table, right next to a half-dead orchid and an unopened bottle of red wine I had been saving for a major milestone. This was not the milestone I had planned, but it would have to do. I did not reach for the wine just yet. Instead, I crossed the living room to a tall, nondescript wooden cabinet that no one but me had opened in 15 years. I slid the secret side panel to the right, keyed in a 6-digit security code, and waited for the heavy mechanical click. The drawer inside groaned open like it had not been touched in a decade, which was only partially true. The documents inside were pristine, archived like sacred scrolls. I flipped past old tax forms and positive performance reviews from a former vice president who had actually wept when the company restructured him out. At the very bottom lay a sealed envelope labeled Original Agreement. Inside was my contract. Back when this logistics firm was one bad quarter away from total bankruptcy, I had not just stepped up to help. I had rebuilt their entire back-end routing operations from scratch. I wrote the automation logic for their freight management system in my own living room while eating cold takeout and dodging collections calls. I had not asked for a massive cash bonus back then. Instead, I had asked for something much smarter, and George, the actual chief executive officer and Julian's father, was smart enough to sign it. Clause 12C did not look like much on paper. It was just 3 paragraphs buried between standard arbitration procedures and non-disclosure terms, but I remembered every single word of it. It granted me full intellectual property rights to any custom software I authored on my own personal equipment. It also guaranteed a 2.5% equity stake if the company hit a certain revenue threshold, which it had passed 3 years ago with no payout. But the real kicker was the final sentence. All structural restructuring decisions within my division had to be approved by my own signature, if my systems were still in use. I did not pace the room. I just pulled out my phone, scanned the document, and sent encrypted copies to my personal email, my attorney Lawrence, and Clara, a board member who had once told me she would back me up if the executives ever turned on me. The game was officially on. By the time the emails reached my attorney's inbox, I was already drafting a detailed summary of the systems currently running on the Summit routing protocol, my original codebase. It was still in active use across every distribution center in the country. I knew that without even logging in. They had merely renamed the user interface to Summit Operations a year ago, as if changing the font could somehow erase my digital fingerprints from the source code. I locked the wooden cabinet, walked back to the dining room, and poured myself a modest glass of red wine. I did not drink to toast my departure. I drank to calculate my next moves. Tomorrow would not be about proving Julian wrong in public. It would be about making the entire board of directors remember why I was never the kind of employee they could simply streamline out of existence. The following Tuesday, George returned to the office. He arrived with a stitched-up abdomen from his recent surgery, a very short fuse, and the creeping realization that leaving his son Julian in charge for even a single week was the equivalent of handing a chainsaw to a child. His veteran assistant, Mabel, who was 65 years old and thoroughly terrifying, met him at the elevator with a thick stack of papers and a note that simply read, "You will need coffee first." The moment George stepped into his private office, he saw it. Lawrence had delivered my contract breach notice in triplicate, neatly clipped and placed dead center on the desk like a financial landmine. George's heart must have sunk before he even read the header. Clause 12C was circled in bright red marker. There was likely a brief flicker of hope in his mind that this was just a misunderstanding, or that I was simply making noise to secure a larger severance package. But then he saw the notary stamp and his own signature at the bottom. The date matched the week after our Midwest distribution center had crashed. When I had saved the company from ruin, George sank into his leather chair, his stomach tightening painfully, and not from his surgical incisions. "Mabel," he called out. She poked her head into the office, noting that Julian was already on his way up. George did not thank his assistant. He just rubbed his temples and stared at the contract terms, reading them like a self-inflicted judgment. A sharp knock sounded, and Julian sauntered in, brimming with youthful confidence and wearing wireless earbuds. "Welcome back, Dad," Julian said. "Glad to see you survived the hospital." George did not look up immediately. "Did you fire Walter?" George asked, his voice low and dangerous. Julian shrugged, plopped down into a guest chair, and began tapping his phone. "Yeah, do not worry about it. It was completely legitimate. HR signed off on the whole thing. His role was ancient, and frankly, he was just dead weight. You are always telling me we need to cut legacy costs, so I cut the biggest one." George looked up slowly, his eyes cold. "Did you actually read his employment contract before you did that?" Julian scoffed, waving his hand as if brushing away a fly. "Why should I? It is like 100 pages of old legal jargon. He is just bluffing. He emailed the board with some old PDF, probably hoping we will throw some hush money his way. It is just a bitter ex-employee move." George slid the printed documents across the desk, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and regret. Julian picked them up with a bored expression, flipping through the pages. "Clause 12, paragraph C," George said, his voice dry as dust. "He has veto rights over structural changes, including his own termination, as long as his proprietary systems are still in use, and since they are, firing him without formal board review is a direct breach of contract." Julian blinked, his confidence faltering for a brief second before he recovered. "Wait, what? That cannot be real. Why would you ever sign something like that? It makes no business sense." "Because 15 years ago, our company was bleeding cash, and Walter wrote the logistics protocol that saved us from folding like a lawn chair in a gale," George snapped. "That clause is legally binding. So is his claim to the code. If he presses this, he does not just get his job back. He could shut down our entire shipping network." Julian's face went pale. "But the termination is already processed," he stammered. "His severance package is in the system." "Then you better pray he does not cash it," George replied. For the first time since Julian had stepped into his executive role, George saw his son's composure crack. The silence in the room grew thick. George leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the gray city skyline, feeling the heavy burden of a looming corporate disaster. He sighed, rubbing his chest. Walter does not make empty threats. If he has already reached out to Clara on the board, we are in serious trouble. You did not just fire an employee, Julian. You declared war on the one man who holds the keys to our entire operation. The operational consequences started small, like minor paper cuts that slowly drain the life from a large beast. On Wednesday morning, a major freight shipment, bound for the Midwest hub, did not register on the shipping docks. The client, a major manufacturing corporation that relied on our prompt deliveries, called the front office twice, growing increasingly hostile by the second call. On Thursday, 3 critical invoices went completely missing from our digital database, vanishing as if they had never existed in our records. By Friday afternoon, the Western Distribution Center had mistakenly routed a large shipment of industrial batteries to Vermont instead of Virginia. This error cost the company $6,000 in emergency shipping corrections, not to mention a long apology email that read like it was drafted by a sleep-deprived intern. Each incident on its own was manageable, but together they represented the exact operational issues I had spent 15 years quietly resolving. Before they ever reached the executive's ears, down on the warehouse floor, the chaos was far from quiet. Dock workers stared at blank monitor screens as the barcode scanners returned error messages. The database API was failing because Julian's new implementation team had disabled the legacy server mapping scripts, thinking they were redundant. They did not realize those scripts translated the proprietary freight codes. Outside the main depot in Ohio, delivery trucks were backed up for over 2 miles, their engines idling and blocking the interstate highway. The yard managers were furious, screaming into their radios, but without the core routing logic, no one knew which containers belonged on which trucks. It was a complete bottleneck, and the financial penalties for late delivery were accumulating at a rate of $10,000 for every hour of delay. Our major retail clients were already threatening to cancel their contracts, which would cost the company millions in lost revenue and destroy our reputation in the logistics industry. Meanwhile, the corporate office buzzed with the nervous energy that always precedes a major storm. My name was whispered in the hallways, in the break room, and on private messaging threads. "Did you hear about the contract clause?" One logistic coordinator muttered near the scanner. Another employee whispered that the board was scrambling because Julian had bypassed the proper approval channels to push me out. Internal chat threads were filled with memes depicting the shipping delays. One popular image circulated on the internal server showed a cartoon of a massive cargo ship sinking, with a caption asking who forgot to call the legacy guy. Clara, the board member I had contacted, remained silent in public, but her silence was deafening to those who understood the company dynamics. Everyone in the building knew that when Clara went quiet, a major corporate shakeup was about to happen. The real blow came on Monday morning when Simon, a junior systems analyst who was quiet but exceptionally bright, was tasked with reviewing the internal code dependencies before a scheduled system update. Working in the basement cubicles under flickering fluorescent lights, Simon ran an automated scan of the code repository. He spent hours tracing database mappings and querying system logs while eating cold pizza. He felt like an archaeologist digging through layers of digital dirt, uncovering files that had not been modified since the early days of the company. 2 hours into his technical audit, he found the target of his search. Tucked deep within the automated load balancing scripts was a block of code adapted directly from my original protocol. The header read, "Copyright Walter, Summit Routing Protocol Core Logic, version 2.4. Do not modify without legal clearance." Simon stared at the screen for several minutes, his coffee growing cold. He realized that the entire digital infrastructure of the company was built on a house of cards. Simon knew that if the system crashed during the next update, the company would lose all tracking capabilities. I had not just written a minor utility. My code was the actual skeleton of the entire freight tracking system. They had renamed the main scripts, but the underlying database tables and routing algorithms still bore my copyright tags. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Simon showed the findings to his immediate supervisor. The supervisor began to sweat, nervously tapping his fingers on the desk, and told Simon to keep the file safe. Simon took screenshots of the code, saved them in a secure folder, and left a printed copy on his manager's desk with a sticky note suggesting the company owed me substantial royalties. That note traveled up the chain of command with alarming speed. It reached HR by mid-afternoon and the legal department before the end of the day. By Tuesday morning, George's inbox was flooded with urgent messages regarding my intellectual property rights. Throughout all of this, I did not say a word. My absence was doing all the talking for me. It was like a missing load-bearing beam in a house. Everything seemed fine until the roof began to sag. The executives were beginning to realize that I was not just a disgruntled retiree. I was a legal liability sitting on their boardroom table, and no one knew how to defuse the situation. At exactly 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, my attorney Lawrence sent a formal notice of contract breach to the board of directors. Lawrence was a seasoned attorney who had represented logistics professionals for 3 decades, and he wrote the email with cold precision, knowing that the company's legal department would immediately recognize the severity of the situation. The email was concise, professional, and devoid of any emotional language. It outlined how my termination violated Clause 12C of my contract since the company was still actively utilizing my proprietary logistics software. It also highlighted that the company had failed to pay the agreed-upon royalties for the software's use over the past 3 years. Lawrence attached clear evidence, including screenshots of the copyright tags Simon had discovered and a copy of the original signed contract, complete with a notary seal. He concluded the email by stating that while we hoped to resolve this matter amicably through structured negotiations, we were fully prepared to seek an immediate injunction in federal district court to halt the use of the software if a resolution was not reached. By 8 in the morning, the responses began to arrive. Clara was the first to reply, asking when I would be available to meet with the board's legal counsel. Shortly after, Helen, the head of compliance, sent a message requesting a formal discussion. I did not rush to answer. I knew the leverage was entirely on my side. At 9 o'clock, the executive floor was quiet, but the atmosphere was tense. Scheduled meetings were abruptly canceled, and Julian's morning presentation on future logistics trends was postponed without explanation. George spent the morning with the company's attorneys in the main conference room, reviewing every document Julian had signed since taking over. They sat around the mahogany table, in heavy leather chairs, the tension thick in the air. George sat holding his stomach, his surgical stitches aching from the stress as he read our demands. They quickly realized that Julian had not only fired me without authority, but he had also approved a system upgrade that copied my original code without my consent, attempting to overwrite my name in the system logs. This was a clear violation of corporate policies and federal laws. In the legal world, this is known as willful infringement, and it carries heavy financial penalties. One senior attorney warned George that I could sue for copyright infringement under Title 17, Section 106 of the United States Code, which could result in statutory damages of up to $150,000 per infraction, plus attorney fees. Furthermore, because the systems were integral to daily operations, an injunction would effectively shut down the company's shipping network, costing millions of dollars a day. Julian's attempt to streamline the department had instead created a legal crisis that threatened the company's survival. The board members were furious. Julian had acted without consulting legal or the board, violating his fiduciary duty to the corporation and exposing them to immense financial liability. The attorneys advised George that they had zero chance of winning in court because my signature was completely absent from any restructuring approval form, which directly breached the contract's explicit clause. While Julian was busy posing for photos with the public relations team in the main lobby, pretending to be a visionary leader who was modernizing the company, the board was quietly preparing to strip him of his authority. The legal memos were circulating, and the board members were beginning to openly question Julian's competence. George knew he had to act before the situations escalated further. He called my phone twice, leaving messages asking to meet privately to resolve the issue. Julian also tried to call me, leaving a panicked voicemail, where his voice cracked as he suggested we sit down and talk like professionals. He followed up with multiple text messages begging to meet for coffee, promising to resolve everything man to man. I did not return his calls. I wanted him to understand that the time for informal favors had passed. The board was scheduled to meet the following morning, and I knew they would have no choice but to address my demands. To make matters worse for Julian, he had walked down to the IT department that afternoon and demanded that the junior systems analyst, Simon, delete my copyright tags from the source code. Julian had walked in with his face red and breathing heavily, slamming his hands on Simon's desk. Simon was startled, looking up from his dual monitors. Julian demanded that he delete my copyright tags immediately, suggesting it was just a minor reformatting task, and even hinted at a potential promotion with a significant salary raise for Simon if he complied. But Simon, recognizing the severe legal implications of altering copyrighted code and committing corporate fraud, politely refused. Once Julian stormed out, Simon immediately sent a message to the compliance officer, Helen, and the HR director, attaching a detailed transcript of the exchange. This was the final straw. By 5 o'clock that evening, the compliance department had downgraded Julian's security clearance, blocking his access to the production servers and ensuring he could do no further damage. On Thursday afternoon, George arrived at my house. He was not wearing his usual executive suit, opting instead for casual slacks and a simple jacket. He looked tired, his face pale from his recent medical procedure and the stress of the past week. I let him in and showed him to the dining room, where my attorney Lawrence had laid out our formal demands. The room was quiet, with the afternoon sun shining through the window onto the polished wood table. I offered him a glass of water, which he accepted with a grateful nod. He looked around the room, commenting on how many years had passed since he last visited. He recalled the early days of the company, when we worked out of a small garage drinking cheap beer and drafting routing manifests by hand. He admitted that his ambition to grow the company made him lose sight of the people who built it, and that Julian's business school education had taught him how to read spreadsheets, but not how to respect the workers. George took a slow sip of water, his hands trembling slightly, and looked at me with tired eyes. "I know I have no right to ask for favors, Walter," George said, his voice quiet. "We have known each other for a long time, and I know how much you poured into this company. I made a massive mistake by letting my personal desires for my son override my business judgment. Julian is my son, and I wanted him to succeed, but I did not realize he would act with such disregard for the rules and the people who made this company possible." He admitted that Julian had acted foolishly, and that the board was prepared to offer me a full reinstatement, 6 months of back pay, a retroactive equity adjustment, and a new 2-year licensing contract for the software. I listened quietly, then shook my head. "I have no interest in returning to the company, George," I said. "I have already accepted a consulting role with Apex Freight, your primary competitor." George stared at me, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the water glass. "You would go to our competitors?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. I smiled slightly and leaned back. "They are paying me a fair rate for my expertise, and they respect my intellectual property. However, I am willing to license my current software to you for a period of 2 years to give you time to transition to a new system. But it will cost you." Lawrence slid the licensing agreement across the table. The terms were strict, requiring an upfront payment of $300,000 and a monthly royalty of $15,000, along with strict compliance audits to ensure no further duplication occurred. George read the document, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the sheer scale of the financial penalty. He knew he had no choice. Without my software, Summit's operations would grind to a halt within days, resulting in bankruptcy. He signed the agreement. The following morning, the board met to finalize the terms and address Julian's actions. I attended the meeting via video conference, sitting quietly as Lawrence presented the signed licensing agreement. Julian was also present, looking defeated and no longer wearing his smug smirk. He sat in the corner, realizing his career in the logistics industry was effectively over. Clara read the board's resolution aloud, her voice clear and formal. The resolution stated that in light of recent contract breaches, copyright infringements, and failures of leadership, the board was immediately stripping Julian of his title as Chief Operating Officer. He was reassigned to a minor administrative role in the back-office compliance division in another state, with no decision-making power, no staff reporting to him, and a severely reduced salary. Furthermore, the resolution authorized the immediate execution of the licensing agreement with Walter, agreeing to pay all required royalties and licensing fees from the company's reserve funds. The board members voted one by one to approve the resolution, with George casting the final silent vote. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a single week. He did not look at his son, nor did he look at the camera. He simply nodded and muttered his approval. The board also approved the licensing fees, which would be paid directly to my personal account. When the meeting concluded, Julian looked at me through the screen, his face red with anger and his fists clenched on the table. "You ruined my plans," he muttered. "You ruined everything I was trying to build here." I looked at him, my expression calm. "I did not ruin anything, Julian," I said. "I simply enforced the terms of the agreement your father signed 15 years ago. You wanted to streamline legacy costs, but you forgot that legacy is what keeps this place running. You cannot run a shipping empire on spreadsheet theories and arrogance. You have to respect the people who built the foundation." I ended the video call, shut my laptop, and stood up from my desk. I had spent 15 years building a system that was essential to the company's success, and I had finally received the compensation and respect I deserved. I walked out into my garden, enjoying the quiet afternoon air, knowing that my future was secure and that the company would be paying for my work for years to come. I had built a legacy, and I had successfully protected it from those who did not understand its value.